Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our May 2026 Idea Jam. My name is Stan Baines, and I will be your chair for this jam session this evening. And I'm a steering committee member of the Canadian Network for Imagination and Creativity, or CNIC for short. My fellow scenic members and friends in creativity that are with us this evening are scattered about on your Zoom screen. So if you could, committee, just give us a wave, let everybody know where you are and who you are. Awesome. At Scenic, it's our goal to find our shared imagination and creativity and view it from different backgrounds we come from, see things from the different angles that we exist in, and to create and foster open, forward thinking dialogue. Our idea jams that we host each month is our place to share with you different topics, discussions, and ideas from our hosts, guests, and then to have those open conversations that flow with you afterwards. It's our hope that through these discussions that we have at each event that we can collaborate and explore through idea sharing, expand our minds in new directions we didn't think of before, create new and long-lasting partnerships in our differences, in our sameness, and in our beliefs. We want to find and foster our inner and outer creativity and do this together in our learning and listening space so we can carry forward those concepts, those discussions, those ideas out into our worlds and then into our spheres of influence. At this time, I'd like to acknowledge that as a resident of Clarence Rockland, Ontario, which sits just outside the east end of the city of Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, I'm chairing our meeting on traditional unceded land of the Algonquin Anishinaabe territory and people. I'm thankful for this opportunity to be able to do so this evening and every time that we meet. As the sun shines on our path to tomorrow, we remember the storms of yesterday. We remember the sorrow, but look hopefully toward a brighter future together. In our idea jams, we want you to reflect and participate in the way you are most comfortable with and make this idea space your own. Our idea jam is our space to learn, explore, and to share. We want to hear your ideas through conversations and in our chats. This is a place where talking your idea is what it's all about. Your thoughts, your inklings, and your ideas help keep the space moving forward. So this is kind of your time to shine as well. Our format here is very simple. Once our hosts guide our discussions for the evening, we will open the floor to you for our chats and conversations to begin, see where our journey will lead us together during our time. We do this together with respect in mind, regard for everyone's position in our conversations, and thoughtfulness in our chats. Nothing is a bad idea. Every discussion point helps move the idea along. Please take this opportunity to explore and share as your insights may be the spark that lights someone else's creativity fire. As you can see, Zoom is our platform of choice for this discussion. Zoom allows us to participate in many different ways. It has built-in controls that allow you to raise your hand so we can see you when you wish to join in the conversation. You can obviously add things in our chat function, which helps to keep the ideas and thoughts flowing. And you can share your emotions with the little emotion emoticons, I guess, and share that way as well. Share your ideas your way and join in our jam. So for tonight, we are going to be led by Goran Matic. Our topic of discussion for this evening is engaging wicked problems with creativity and imagination, reframing to extend the boundaries of the possible. So with that, over to you, Goran.
Thank you very much. Such a pleasure to have you all here. I'm just going to go ahead and to share my mini little slide deck. So you'll just let me know when you can hopefully see that. Is that visible? Can everyone see that now?
Yep, it's up.
Perfect. So definitely, as Stan mentioned, my name is Goran Matic, and just a little bit about my background. When I was a kid, I kind of wanted to be either a painter or a pilot or maybe a computer scientist. And then, my dad bought me a computer when I was 12 years old. It was one of these first computers that were out there, and the computer had a grand total of 2 kilobytes of memory. That was an upgraded model because the original one had just 1 kilobyte of memory. That fits about one page of text on your screen. Then I fell in love with it, and I was like, I'll be a programmer, and I was kind of playing with it and for many years. And I ended up being just sort of in the field. I did a bunch of sort of work around computers and information systems and physics. Ended up as a software systems architect in healthcare. And I felt by that point that I was kind of, I thought that I had a pretty good understanding of the world, you know. I thought with all this kind of reading I was doing because I was curious that I actually understood quite a bit. And I thought that, a solution to everything, because, I was working as a software systems architect was a good blueprint. I thought, well, whatever problem you throw at us, I mean, you just need a good blueprint and that will solve it, right? And you can kind of see how this is a little bit of a naive approach, but I didn't know this at the time. And then my moment of sort of revelation came when I, encountered a problem in sort of healthcare, trying to construct large systems that involved, many different stakeholders across the healthcare landscape. And all of a sudden, I discovered that a blueprint was not solving it, and I just wasn't sure why. You know, it's just that with the blue, it was not a question of kind of, thinking mechanistically or just kind of putting some kind of a solution in the midst of all this. It was a question of dealing with people and with complexity. And I honestly just didn't have a language to think about it. I looked around, I discovered this, program at the Oak University here in Toronto called Strategic Foresight and Innovation. It was a master's program that was, in essence, based on three core themes: design thinking, systems thinking, and foresight, a kind of discipline of thinking about futures. And through that exploration, I discovered that the problems with stakeholders and complexity, this particular field has actually been thought about for decades. And in fact, one of my friends and mentors here is on the call, Jude Lombardi, who's a senior figure in the cybernetics community. So thank you, Jude, for joining us today. And as part of this exploration, absolutely, I sort of discovered that there's a whole world that I certainly was not aware of. And that's what we're going to be sort of doing a brief dip into today, thinking about some of these typologies of complexity that showed up in my master's thesis research, and then we'll be trying to make a connection to imagination and creativity and the kind of work that we do here at the Canadian Network for Imagination and Creativity is a kind of a bridge towards engaging these topics. So, the working theme here is really around these wicked problems and other complex challenges, and how might imagination and creativity really be perceived as critical enablers. So if we think about it, what are wicked problems and complex challenges? Um, I know that some of you as researchers and academics are working with this. Some of you have kind of come across this in less or more formal ways. Perhaps you've heard of the term, but certainly all of us are dealing with it, and certainly in your in various ways, in your daily life, in your personal and professional careers, increasingly we're dealing with, complex things. Several definitions definitely exist. They do tend to sort of agree in some ways. They complement each other in other ways. Perhaps the most popular one is the wicked problems. It's certainly not the only one, but it did come out in a paper by Rittel and Webber in 1973, who were at UCLA at the time. And they were dealing with the Department of Planning, and they were sort of wondering how could they categorize these issues, that urbanists and urban designers and planners deal with, as they're kind of trying to work with a rich ecosystem of stakeholders in a complex challenge such as designing cities and neighborhoods and so on. If you dig a little bit deeper, you'll notice that actually the first mention of the term wicked problems comes a little bit earlier. I forget when, I think 1969 or 1970 or something, in an editorial for a journal written by Churchman, who was actually commenting on Professor Rittel's expose, who had given a sort of a talk. So Churchman kind of says, hey, this is a thing that's going to be interesting. We might wish to pay attention to it. And of course, he was quite right. I'd like to argue. Um, and if we don't really have the time today, we would need a lot more time to dive into each of these typologies of complexity. But it turns out that there are, there's significant and foundational work that even actually precedes Rittel and Webber. So if you look at a top left, bottom left, problematiques, Hassan Ozbekan and Christakis. Christakis is, by the way, still alive, operating out of Greece and still giving seminars. Um, and coming out of 1970, this was the idea that they famously came up with this idea of 49 mutually interacting challenges, and there were things like acceleration of armaments, increasing tensions between the haves and the have-nots, the global hunger and things like this. Um, the Wicked Problems is the one that we just talked about, the 1973 paper. But Akoff, who is a strangely, in my opinion, sort of undervalued theorist, talks about the social messes. And, Akoff, who always had a lot of charming character, kind of talks with, I think, great gusto about, what he calls social messes. And you can kind of see even from the title of what he calls it, that it's a kind of a mess that's of a social nature, that there's something profoundly social about these types of issues. And then, other folks like Cilliers, who takes more of a kind of physics approach and kind of more critical thinking approach, talks about postmodern complexity. And recently, I was surprised to find that Levin et al. In 2012 published a wonderful kind of extension of the wicked problem theory in a very thick legal journal. I think this paper was published on like page 1022 or something. I've never read a legal journal, but it must be very thick. They kind of extend this idea, of wicked problems, and they sort of say, well, in addition to all this, Weber and Rittel famously posit that there are 10 kind of symptoms of how you can recognize that something is a wicked problem. And, one of which is that, well, there's no clear definition. Once you're dealing with a problem that you cannot really define, where if you kind of bring 10 experts in a room, they'll give you 10 very good, well-informed opinions, but they will not necessarily be identical. Then you know that you're in a kind of a presence of a wicked problem. And Lubin et al. In 2012 extend this to sort of say, well, in addition to all of this, there are also these dimensions of super wickedness, in a sense that phenomena like climate change and other complex phenomena also kind of overwhelm our spatial, or other kind of cognitive senses that, we're just not necessarily predisposed to thinking about something that's happening over great time scales or great spatial scales. And so you can kind of see how there's a kind of this rich diversity of thinking about complexity and what is it that actually makes, things complex. And, um, you know, even though there's this richness, the diversity of kind of this, analysis of what is it that makes things complex, certainly one of the roots of it, at least in my own kind of research, or what I kind of certainly wanted to posit in my thesis, is that the complexity definitely does seem to come from different kind of experiences that different stakeholders have when they're encountering a given complex social challenge. So we could call it in many different ways. I happen to call it, kind of these experiential perceptive cones, because we as human beings, don't tend to sort of have, omni kind of perceptive capability. We don't tend to perceive kind of everything. We tend to perceive something in a kind of a cone of light, as it were, as famously popularized by Einstein. So that, the complexity comes in part from this feature of our own very own perception, that as we're looking at these complex challenges, everyone perceives a very valid part of it, but those parts might not be the same. And as you kind of read the literature, there's always, the famous elephant, and how different people with blindfolds are touch on different parts of the elephant, and they're asked to describe what is it like. And one says, well, the elephant is like a snake because they're touching the trunk. And the other one says, well, the elephant is like a tree, because they're touching the leg, and so on. So they're not incorrect, and that's a kind of a key key challenge of complex social challenges. They really have valid perspectives. It's just a question of what can one do really in the presence of this complexity? How might these various perspectives be ameliorated in some kind of a constructive way? And so when we think about, why should creativity and imagination, matter when we encounter complex challenges, I'd like to suggest or posit that well, it might be because complex challenges feature at least several key characteristics. When we kind of attempt to kind of look at all those typologies of complexity, we see some commonalities, and certainly what most other theorists seem to suggest is that there is a kind of a deep interconnectedness in complex challenges. And there's also this sense of kind of prevalent ambiguity. And if we think about the previous example, these kind of cognitive cones looking at, a complex challenge like hunger or climate change or whatever you might wish to take a look at, there is a fair amount of ambiguity there when we consider different stakeholders and kind of making these valid observations. Another, characteristic are these indefinite boundaries. It's very challenging to kind of say, where exactly does a complex challenge begin or end? Who gets to posit that this kind of boundary around a complex challenge? And because of the previous, three sort of characteristics, then there's also by necessity lack of clear heuristics. So we don't have the time to kind of dive into all the other sort of things that have been said about this because it would probably take us a day-long seminar. But it's worthwhile to say that for those of you that are interested, the kind of framework from Snowden is kind of interested in a sense that it kind of gets into this whole heuristics piece, but we will skip over that for today and perhaps visit that at some other time. One example of this kind of indefinite nature of boundaries, can be sort of seen when we take a look at an example such as this. So let's say that all of us on this call are, invited to be part of a design team and, maybe for a school or something. And we're trying to say, well, let's define an organizational strategy for this school. And pretty soon we start thinking about innovation because aren't we all encouraged to innovate these days? And, as soon as you start talking about innovation, we start realizing that, well, it's hard to talk about innovation actually without reflecting on, the culture, the governance of our school or the school system itself, and so on. And if we think about the students, it's difficult to consider students as kind of all being equal. There's a little bit of inequality in students, and that kind of impacts their healthcare and their ability to attend classes and so on. So pretty soon you start discussing the kind of healthcare policy and food security. Do we have food programs? And are we taking care of our students? Are they worried about where is their next meal going to come from? Or are they free to actually think about their academic pursuits? And as you kind of start going down the line of this line of reasoning, you can kind of see how the conversation can very quickly expand into, well, equitable wealth creation. And, well, how can we have equitable, wealth creation when we're in the midst of a giant change in the nature of work? And, we got AI all over the place where no one's certain about anything. You can kind of see where this is going. Pretty soon you start thinking about, well, what is it that actually makes the economy sustainable? What's the nature of value, And pretty soon you're thinking about, well, actually, if you think about AI, the key issues are actually electricity and water and cooling. And, if we dedicate everything, just as an example, as a hypothetical line of reasoning, to cooling these data centers, what about places that suffer from disasters that are happening all over the world? How can we manage this long-term disaster recovery in the ever-shortening sort of environment of resources that are increasingly depleted, which can kind of get us to this natural resource management question and ultimately to kind of the climate change. How can we actually manage things when things are changing all around us? So you can kind of see, though this example is a little bit exaggerated, but you can kind of see how we could start with something that's fairly straightforward. Hey, isn't it reasonable to have an organizational strategy? And you can actually end up over the climate change because this deep interconnectedness, and the lack of boundaries are really pervasive in the midst of, complex challenges. So I'd like to posit that as change makers and change agents, we are, in fact, using creativity and imagination to deal with this all the time. We just might not be thinking about it because we are creatively setting up boundaries and trying to articulate where's the right line of establishing the boundary within these ever kind of enclosing systems of relevance. How can we posit the limit of analysis in a way that makes the most sense? Um, and The most beautiful story I've ever come across is Akoff's story about the old lady. I didn't put a reference to the paper here, but I'll be glad to share it later. And it's a relatively unknown paper, which I found surprising because the story is so brilliant. And I'll summarize it very briefly. And Akoff, it's actually a true story, um, where Akoff was working with a bunch of with a number of urban designers that were actually trying to improve the health and well-being of an endangered community, and they wondered how of an underprivileged community. They sort of wondered how can we approach this community? How can we do it in a way that's respectful and so on? And then as they were having these regular meetings, somebody approached them and said, actually, did you know that there's a 79-year-old lady that's already engaged in this community? She's already started a school for young mothers so that someone can take, care of the children so that these mothers can get back to work. And everyone was amazed, and they said, can you please find this lady? They invited the old lady to their meetings, and they were shocked to discover that this person actually started all this by herself and managed to organize a great deal of stuff. And they were just so inspired. They started working with her. And fair warning, because this is a kind of a sad story. But on her way back home, the lady was climbing a 4-story building, and she got a heart attack and she died. And when the team, I think this was in UCLA, but please forgive me if I get a city wrong. Um, when they got the news, they were all devastated, and there was a silence that fell upon the room, as Akoff describes. And then one of the folks spoke about it and sort of said in a obviously disappointed way. I think this was the chief of healthcare, said, well, if actually we had more budget, for detecting this type of preliminary conditions, we would have been able to detect that this lady, had an undetected heart issue, and we would have been able to prevent it before she died. And everyone kind of nodded, and he sat down, and then the chief architect sort of stood up and said, well, if we had more budget to actually put usable elevators in low-rise buildings, this lady would have never had to take the stairs, because she just would have gotten to this elevator and climbed, and she would have lived. And everyone agreed and nodded, and then the chief of social services spoke up and said, actually, you're all wrong, because I knew this old lady. I actually was working with her son, and her son was estranged, and the son lives on the first floor. If my department had more budget, we would have been able to reach this old lady and to repair the relationship with her son, and she would have been living with him. She would have never climbed these stairs, and she would have lived. And as you see where this story is going, Akoff basically precisely describes the complexity of the situation. None of them are wrong, all of them are right, kind of. The question is, what does one do, in the midst of this plethora of valid perspectives? And so, again, that in itself is a huge conversation, but I will just offer Akoff's response, because one interesting thing is that when one dives into these topologies of complexity, they are truly amazing and brilliant, although they're a little thin on prescription. So they're much kind of more situated in sort of how does one recognize, a complex challenge, and what are the sort of elements of a complex challenge. But there isn't a lot necessarily said about, well, what can we do about it? There are a lot of theories that kind of posit their own views on this. Akoff, however, offers something very useful. And he sort of shares these 4 levels of dealing with a complex challenge, and sort of says, it's not a problem, because problem is something that we have in mathematics where we have a definitive, we know that we've solved it. Akoff sort of suggests that complex challenges have at least 4 ways of dealing with them, where the absolution is in essence a kind of a way of saying, well, actually, we're just going to ignore this right now. We don't have the budget, we don't have the resources. We'll just put this on ice and hope it gets better. The resolution is something where you resolve something, not necessarily the entirety of a complex challenge, because actually, in principle, the theorists agree that you cannot fully resolve a complex challenge. But at least you solve something. So Acuff uses this language of satisfices. So resolution is something that satisfies something, at least you've done something. A solution is something more profound. So it yields or comes as close as possible to the best possible outcome, something that optimizes. So again, because it's a complex challenge, you haven't solved the whole thing, but you've optimized it as much as possible. Whereas the dissolution is often what we mean by solving, that's very, very elusive, which is to redesign, either the entity that has the problem or mess, or its environment in such a way as to eliminate the problem or mess and enable the system involved to do better in the future than the best it can do today in order to idealize. So you can kind of see how Acuff's idea of transformation, of dissolution, kind of implies this idea of dissolving the complex challenge in the present state and transforming it to some other state in the future. And again, you can kind of see how this has arguably a lot to do with creativity and imagination, because in order to transform something, from a present state to an idealized future state, by necessity, we're arguably talking about imagination. And so as you dig into the theory, you see that, there are just a lot of theorists that kind of get into a lot of interesting stuff here. Certainly Webber and Horn are intriguing. They kind of have their own take on what are the key signs that you're dealing, with a complex challenge. So it's kind of very similar to what Rittel and Webber say, but this is kind of in their own words. By the way, this is another Webber. It's not the Webber from the Rittel's paper. I guess it's a popular name for complexity. And so they kind of talk about the fact that, there's no unique or correct view of the problem. It's kind of like we talked about. There are different views of the problem and there are contradictory solutions. There's this idea of interconnectedness where most problems are kind of connected to other problems. Uncertain or missing data, multiple value conflicts, because, different stakeholders have very reasonable, different values because they're focused on different things. Maybe they're ideological, cultural constraints or political or economic ones. Multi-valued thinking. So often alogical or illogical or multi-valued thinking. So you'll kind of see why this ended up popping up in my research later on, this idea that what might seem illogical to us might be simply multi-valued thinking from someone else's perspective. And so therefore it has to be addressed in an appropriate way. Numerous possible intervention points, because these things are big, think climate change or hunger, how there are many different ingress points there. Consequences are difficult to imagine. This is something that Webber and Rittel say as well. They phrase it differently. They say that, every effort counts, basically, because it's like, well, if you make a policy change in healthcare, you can kind of anticipate something, but in reality, you don't exactly know what's going to happen, same in education and so on. Considerable uncertainty, ambiguity. There's that word ambiguity again from Webber and Horn, a great resistance to change. This could be a subject of another talk. Why are we so resistant to change as people? We just like the way things are. Most of us, some are fluid and creative, and I suspect many of you are. But for most part, most of us are kind of, let me be the way I like my work to look like. And problem solver is out of contact with the problems and potential solutions. So often, when you look at quote unquote designers, there's a question around, to what extent might a designer have lived experience or deep understanding of the actual question that's being quote unquote solved. So, we might attempt, as certainly I did in my thesis work, to kind of arrive at some kind of a conceptual synthesis. Something that sort of helped, at least my thinking, was this idea from Brian Masumi, called affect theory, that I know has popped up in some of your own research from 1995. And the affect is a precognitive state. It's a kind of a feeling that occurs before it hits, our sort of conscious awareness, Masumi argues. And sort of in my thesis work, it came up as individual affect and social affect, that, when we engage these complex challenges, they sort of affect us in ways that are not easy to understand. And they affect us both individually and kind of socially, so which is to say collectively. And Masumi has a slightly disturbing but brilliant story in his book, The Anatomy of Affect. And I think it's actually really on one of the opening pages of the book. And the story is a very innocuous and seemingly very innocent story. It's about a cartoon that was airing in Germany in the 1990s. And the cartoon is seemingly a very, very simple one. It's just about a snowman that, goes on top of the house in this hot summer sun, and the snowman melts. That's the cartoon. Um, but then the social services and mental health care workers around Germany started getting calls and complaints that there was something profoundly disturbing about this cartoon. No one knew why, but for whatever reason, this cartoon really disturbed children that were watching it, and everyone was quite surprised. So Brian Masumi famously does an experiment, plays this cartoon to children while having them connected to ECG or EKG, and discovers that there are neurological, physiological responses before the brain is even aware to perceiving these images. The body in some way is reacting with a bodily response to these images that are kind of hitting, the eyes of children. And so, all of it simply to suggest that when we're dealing with complexity, it's not just that there's this kind of cognitive aspect, there's also this kind of a precognitive aspect that we have to deal with. So if we're attempting some kind of a methodological synthesis, and I'm not going to bother you with this wheel here because we could be again spending a few hours talking about this, but what I found the most interesting is that if we look at what certainly, I attempted to argue are kind of the necessary skills, or at least helpful skills for dealing with complexity for teams and groups, I specifically focused on teams, then as you kind of go deeper down the kind of this sense-making depth, which is to say the ability to kind of make sense of the situation, um, I think certainly I was surprised that this notion of dialectical thinking popped up. This notion of dialectics, which comes in Hegel and pops up all over the place afterwards. And this idea of dilemmas, and this kind of came from my professor because that was my thesis sort of advisor. And at some point, Alexander Manu says, we're not dealing with problems here, right? And I said, okay, but if we're not dealing with problems, then what are we dealing with? And Alexander Manu says, we're dealing with dilemmas. I said, really, dilemmas? Interesting. And when you dive into it, you discover that there's this whole rich literature about dialectics and dilemmas that are basically, again, going back to this idea of multivalent states. It's not about this or that. It's about reconciling. A dilemma is something where we in some way need to reconcile between at least this and that. There could be more this and that. And in order to do that, the psychology literature suggests that this ability of dialectic thinking is very much required. And again, as in reflecting on that, some years later, when I discovered this wonderful community of scenic, I realized, oh, this is where creativity and imagination come in. This is why so many, of you that are part of this community, are so successful at dealing with these complex things, because creativity and imagination require this dialectic thinking. We might not know it because we haven't studied psychology and we haven't looked at the theorists, but that's arguably part of what's happening there. So creativity and imagination come up as kind of key enablers of this dialectical thinking. And for all those of you that are interested, please reach out to me, because there's a beautiful theorist out of MIT that, again, is kind of strangely forgotten or undiscovered, who kind of wrote the whole tome on dialectical thinking. And so moving towards this idea of kind of theoretical synthesis, my question was, okay, but So what's really then making this complexity complex? Like if you need all these skills, you know, and if you look at all of these things, what's complex about complexity, when we're trying to engage these complex challenges? And what really kind of came up is that, well, it's really about these ambiguities. And if we're trying to collaborate together, there's at least three ambiguities: the cognitive one, the contextual one, and the cooperative one. And the cognitive one is really, being just kind of flummoxed, not being sure how might we think about a complex challenge, and what modes of cognition might be most appropriate to even think about it. How might we think about world hunger or world peace or climate change? It's not easy to even, you know, sort of think about what kind of cognitive lens can we put on it. Once we decide on this cognitive lens, the next ambiguity is this kind of contextual one. How can we think about the context? What models can describe this environment? And again, in the literature, theorists take great pains to kind of suggest that, well, the model is really incapable of describing, a complex challenge. So, it's always evolving, it's dynamic. So, at very best, it's going to be an incomplete snapshot. But still, we need something to model our environments with, arguably. So, what models might be most fitting? And finally, when we kind of resolve this cognitive and contextual ambiguity, which I argue many of you are really experts in as part of this community, then it comes, this notion of how might we actually work together to collaborate? How might we cooperate? This cooperative ambiguity, in a sense that what approaches might be most appropriate to connect all this group genius and these valid different perspectives that are still kind of different and sometimes seem incompatible. And these ambiguities arguably interact and kind of complexify collaboration. So this is, again, going back to Jude's sort of cybernetics and sort of systems theory. They're not static. These ambiguities actually affect each other as well. And so the argument that I wanted to make was that these ambiguities interact and they emerge in complex environments. And so leveraging creativity and imagination can really help us to encounter them, and so when we think about this cognitive ambiguity, whatever complex challenge we're attempting to engage, some of the framing questions might be, how might I or we be able to think about it? What modes of cognition might be most appropriate? When we think about the contextual ambiguity, we can think of the conceptual structures, what conceptual structures might I be able to use to describe this phenomena? What conceptual approaches might be most appropriate? And finally, these cooperative ambiguities around, thinking about cooperation. So some of the prompting questions might be, how might I or we be able to most effectively cooperate, or what cooperative approaches might be most appropriate? And so at this point, I'd like to turn it over to you guys and to open up for some sharing and conversation on this first ambiguity, the cognitive one. So maybe perhaps if you would be so kind to share, when and how have you leveraged creativity and imagination to help clarify or maybe even disperse cognitive ambiguity in your own sort of practice and experience? And I'm sorry, I know I threw a lot of stuff your way from a theoretical sort of perspective. It was like a 2.5 years worth of thesis research, but just bringing it back to you guys, um, more towards your own experience, thinking about, really confusion, working with your coworkers, working with your students. I see there is Fred with some thoughts.
Uh, I was on a team from the BC Association of Math Teachers, and we called it social justice mathematics. But what we were doing was creating problems, wicked problems, that were mildly wicked because we didn't want to have too much controversy, especially since I was on an elementary team. And one of the things that we would do is ask a question like, what is the best way to get to school? And because it's such a broad problem, students would start to realize it depends on what lens we use, right? We could say, well, this way's shortest. We could say this way's easiest. We could say this way's prettiest. We could say there's a bully that lives at that house and there's wicked dogs at that house, so we got to go around that, and they just kept growing, and they had to come to a consensus on which factors or constraints would they apply. And I think that's what we need to do, is because a lot of us grew up without being able to think this way. So we have to be very creative in how we train our generation to also do this, because we were used to listening in school. We weren't used to solving problems. We were answering questions that people had already told us how to solve. And so I think it's something that needs to start early and grow from there.
Brilliant. So we heard you say, really listening, and working with everyone there, with all the participants, and then mapping, and trying to find patterns, which is exactly, I think, what the best of theories seem to suggest as well. Thank you. Dean, over to you.
First of all, let me just say, Goran, I have not been so stimulated and enjoyed a talk since at least last month, or to be less silly about it. This is right up my bailiwick, the academic approach and understanding, and all the research I've done on creativity as such. And one of the things that I've, when you talk about on the list of things, how do you define a wicked problem? Sometimes taking your heuristics, the fourth point in one of your slides, sometimes a wicked problem is simply one that doesn't already have an answer. And most of us, as you said, wrote in heuristics, most of us see a problem and go, oh, we do this. Therefore, it does not. It is not really a problem, first of all, and it's certainly not a wicked problem. Another way to think of it is a wicked problem is the antithesis or the opposite of an algorithmic solution. So chess is certainly not a wicked problem. It's just a headache. Now, thank you for the ACOF stuff. You also talked about boundaries with Sondheim. Notice I'm not answering your questions yet. Sondheim used to say, Stephen Sondheim, singer-songwriter, musician who wrote some of the great musicals. And Michael will know a lot of Sondheim music. And he said, having boundaries was so important to his writing. I'm paraphrasing. So when somebody said, I need lyrics and music for this character who does this and this, it simplified the writing. But, all right, so if I give you sheet music like this, it's pretty straightforward. I give you a blank page and I walk away. That's wicked. No instructions. That's wicked. First year, a person who's instructing a university course for the very first time and has said, can you teach this course? That's mildly wicked. They're going to draw on their own experience. So that was heuristics that said. About cooperation, Harvard teaches a course on leadership. And it is a very specific course wherein a lot of the work is interactive, ongoing by the students. And most of the students come to this course thinking in terms of A to B, not understanding that they actually have to friendships or alliances with others to move things forward. Otherwise, their ideas will be derailed by people with a stronger personality. And, or as you said, one of the things in the cooperation and in contextual and in the cognitive, we're comfortable where we are, even if it's not working. That's why PCs were better than Apple for a long time, even though something else worked better. Because one, it was cheaper, but I've already bought the machine because it was cheaper. I'm just going to keep working with it and deal with the bugs. So how did I ever do this? Coming back in teaching, I decided I was going to download a lot of responsibility to my students. And I would tell them right on day one, you are going to be teaching each other. And that freaked so many of the students out. They had been trained authoritarian, top down, one solution, one solutions. There was only one right answer. And to have them have to design their own presentation, choose what they were going to present on, how they were going to do it, whether they were going to work with other people, they freaked. And then by the end of the course, they realized, well, not all of them, by the way, let's be honest about that. Some people really are Stephen Sondheims and really want the structure. Just give me the guide rails to get to the end of the course. Thank you. I got my piece of paper, leave. The real students, what I define as students, people who want to learn, absolutely blossomed with that freedom.
That's amazing. Thank you for that, Fred. And I do feel that you did in a way answer this, if I might just highlight some of your great comments there that we heard you talk about freedom and this notion this wonderful notion that you raised, that perhaps what might help us feel more free and liberated is as you were suggesting earlier, also this idea of, as you said, realizing we're not really dealing with a problem, and that we're there's no heuristic or algorithm, as you said. There's many ways of actually approaching it, which is it can be very liberating in a way. I think that's great. And just to give a quick shout out to some great questions here. Michael Kops, I would suggest that ambiguity is all at once cognitive, contextual, and cooperative. Absolutely. Our environment shapes what we think is abstract and concrete, what is possible, the value of the individual and the group. Absolutely. And I feel like this is, part of the challenge of dealing with these types of challenges, and why it's, seemingly not quite possible that we'll ever arrive at an algorithm, and, why the creativity and imagination, are so relevant. I see Peter Gamble has some thoughts here, and we have Lindsay. Lindsay, over to you.
That's funny. I didn't mean to put my hand up, but I do. But I do have a response to this, because just this week we're going in my family, my mom who lives with us, a new diagnosis of dementia, and this is definitely a wicked problem. There's a lot of ambiguity. and there's ups and downs with cognition about it, and there's hers and mine and siblings, and creativity and imagination is going to be, and today was very important. My mom's an artist, and we're talking. She's mostly talking about this as a process rather than I'm thinking about a problem. I'm not going to solve it, but I still think, oh, what's the potential problems and risk management? But she's coming at it with imagination and creativity. And she said to me, my brain may not be functioning well, but my mind is there, and it's much more expansive and bigger. And so she's teaching me about her process. And so what you've been talking about in here with ambiguity, it's really the grace of acceptance in any given moment to help that process emerge, something that we can't know until it's happening right here. So she's talking about acceptance, not embracing the diagnosis and holding on to it at all, but staying in the moment and allowing the process to unfold. That's how we're using it.
I love that. Thank you so much. That's a wonderful sharing. And I feel like you touched upon so many important elements there. Certainly one of them, I love this notion that you champion of, this expansiveness of cognition, that, we might not be really fully tapping into in our modern world, that I know, several of you are working this, many of you perhaps, and publish books and articles in this on this very topic. And that totally resonates with me, this notion of expansiveness. And I love how you said the kind of this mind, maybe the brain is not 100% there, but the mind is much bigger. This reminds me of this really interesting work. I'm not sure if some of you have come across it. I'm sure you have, of Dr. Ian McGilchrist, that has come up with this hemisphere hypothesis. And Dr. Ian McGilchrist wrote this book called The Master and Its Emissary, a very thick tome that is on my reading list, but I haven't yet read. And it seems to be around precisely what you're describing, this notion that this invitation to think about the connection between these hemispheres, and we think of this dialectical reading, and the ability to engage with dialectics, through this ability to hold two seemingly opposing ideas without collapsing them into a solution prematurely, that definitely seems to require this notion of expansiveness that you posit. Thank you. Any other thoughts? Comments? Peter, you have a wonderful point as per usual. Would you like to speak to it? I'm not sure if you're able to have access to camera or voice, or I could just read it. Well, anyway, I love Peter Gamma's comment there. I think Peter might not be able to just get on voice, but you can certainly read it there in the comments. I love this notion that wicked problems remind us that a quality of the relationships within a system often determines the quality of the possibilities that can emerge from it. Machines optimize, living systems adapt, which seems like a wonderful call out to Humberto Maturana. Human beings imagine. And in times of profound complexity, imagination may be one of the most practical capacities we possess, both individual and collective. Just love that. I know that we have tackled a large topic here. I think there's so much more to be said. I know so many of you have so much more to add, but I realize we are coming to the top of the hour. So with your permission, I'm just going to turn this back over to our gracious host.
Thank you, Goran. I can always count on you to get the brain neurons firing when you're presenting. So thank you very much for that. And we have reached that time of the evening where we must bring things to a close. But I want to thank you, Goran, for bringing this wonderful topic ahead, and for everybody for participating with us. We are glad that you can spend that time with us this evening. We want you to know that Scenic is socially connected, so check out our website at www.canadiannetworkforimagination and creativity.com, all one big giant word. Find us online for more information and links for our idea jams, bios, and information on what Scenic is all about. You can also find us on YouTube. Look for us under Canadian Network for Imagination and Creativity to see our idea jams, our roundtable discussions, and you can do this at home or on the go on your mobile device. And we are still working on getting more of them uploaded, so be patient. They are coming. Another exciting piece of news we want to announce and remind everybody is that we are launching a book. So we are currently looking for submissions. We want and need your ideas. Our book will be about play as a catalyst for the imagination. So we are looking for ideas from your submissions to compile into this book, and we are very, very excited about this. If you're interested, have more questions, or definitely want to submit any ideas, check your emails over the next little bit, as we will be sending out another call for submissions and for more information. If you don't see the email within a few days and you desperately want to get a hold of us, please send an email to ritoriverview@gmail.com. I will place that in the chat once I'm done talking. We are really excited about this, and we really want your submissions and ideas. As we close for the evening, we thank you again for joining us this past hour and making time in your evening to be with us here and share. Be back with us again in June on Thursday the 18th at 7 p.m. as we idea jam all over again, and for our last one for the 2025-2026 season. On behalf of all of us here at Scenic, thank you again for spending your Thursday evening with us. Thank you for sharing your creativity and imagination with us, and we look forward to seeing you again in June. That email is coming now. Good night, everybody, and have a great, great evening.